Chapter 9 of the Sons of Master and Man. Life treads on life and heart on heart. We press too close in church and mart to keep a dream or grave apart. Mrs. Browning. The world-old phenomenon of contact of diverse races of men is to have a new exemplification during the new century. Indeed, the characteristics of our age is the contact of European civilization with the world's undeveloped peoples. Whatever we may say of the results of such contact in the past, it certainly forms a chapter in human action not pleasant to look back upon. War, murder, slavery, extermination, and debauchery. This has again and again been the result of carrying civilization and the blessed gospel to the isles of the sea and the heathen without the law. Nor does it altogether satisfy the conscience of the modern world to be told complacently that all this has been right and proper, and the fated triumph of strength over weakness, of righteousness over evil, of superiors over inferiors. It would certainly be soothing if one could readily believe all this, and yet there are too many ugly facts for everything to be thus easily explained away. We feel and know that there are many delicate differences in race psychology, numberless changes that our crude social measurements are not yet able to follow minutely, which explain much of history and social development. At the same time, too, we know that these considerations have never adequately explained or excused the triumph of brute force and cunning over weakness and innocence. It is, then, the strife of honorable men of the 20th century to see that in the future competition of races, the survival of the fittest shall mean the triumph of the good, the beautiful, and the true, that we may be able to preserve for future civilization all that is really fine and noble and strong, and not continue to put a premium on greed, impudence, and cruelty. To bring this hope to fruition, we are compelled daily to turn more and more to a conscientious study of the phenomenon of race contact, to a study frank and fair and not falsified and colored by our wishes or fears. And we have in the South as fine a field of such a study as the world affords. A field, to be sure, which the average American scientist deems somewhat beneath his dignity, which the average man who is not a scientist knows all about, but nevertheless a line of study which, by reason of the enormous race complications with which God seems about to punish this nation, must increasingly claim our sober attention, study, and thought. We must ask, what are the actual relationships of whites and blacks in the South? And we must be answered not by apology or fault-finding, but by a plain, unvarnished tale. In the civilized life of today, the contact of men and their relations to each other falls in a few main lines of action and communication. There is, first, the physical proximity of homes and dwelling places, the way in which neighborhoods group themselves, and the contiguity of neighborhoods. Secondly, in our age chiefest, there are the economic relations, the method by which individuals cooperate for earning a living, for the mutual satisfaction of wants, for the production of wealth. Next, there are the political relations, the cooperations in social control, in group government, in laying and paying the burden of taxation. In the fourth place, there are the less tangible but highly important forms of intellectual contact and commerce, the interchange of ideas through conversations and conference, through periodicals and libraries, and above all, the gradual formation for each community of that curious tertium quid, which we call public opinion. Closely allied with this comes the various forms of social contact in everyday life, in travel, in theater, in house gathering, in marrying, and giving in marriage. Finally, there are the various forms of religious enterprise, of moral teachings and benevolent endeavor. These are the principal ways in which men live in the same communities or brought into contact with each other. It is my present task, therefore, to indicate from my point of view how the black race in the South meet and mingle with the whites in these matters of everyday life. First, as to physical dwellings. It is usually possible to draw in nearly every Southern community a physical color line on the map, on one side of which whites dwell and on the other Negroes. The winding and intricacies of the geographical color line varies, of course, in different communities. I know some towns where a straight line drawn through the middle of the main street separates 9/10 of the whites from 9/10 of the blacks. In other towns, the older settlements of whites have been encircled by a broad band of blacks. In still other cases, little settlements or nuclei of blacks have sprung up amidst surrounding whites. Usually in cities, each street has its distinctive color, and only now and then do the colors meet in close proximity. Even in the country, something of this segregation is manifested in smaller areas, and of course, in the larger phenomenon of the Black Belt. All this segregation by color is largely independent of natural clustering of social grades common to all communities. A Negro slum may be in dangerous proximity to a white residence quarter, while it is quite common to find a white slum planted in the heart of a respectable Negro district. One thing, however, seldom occurs. The best of the whites and the best of the Negroes almost never live in anything like close proximity. It thus happens that in nearly every Southern town and city, both white and blacks see commonly the worst of each other. This is a vast change from the situation in the past, when through the close contact of master and house servant in the patriarchal big house, one found the best of both races in close contact and sympathy, while at the same time the squalor and dull round of toil among the field hands was removed from the sight and hearing of the family. One can easily see how a person who saw slavery thus from his father's parlors and sees freedom on the streets of a great city fails to grasp or comprehend the whole of the new picture. On the other hand, the settled belief of the masses of Negroes that the Southern white people do not have the black man's best interest at heart has been intensified in latter years by this continual daily contact of the better classes of blacks with the worst representatives of the white race. Coming now to the economic relationships of the races, we are on ground made familiar by study, much discussion, and no little philanthropic effort. And yet, with all this, there are many essential elements in the cooperation of Negroes and whites for work and wealth that are too readily overlooked or not thoroughly understood. The average American can easily conceive of a rich land awaiting development and filled with black laborers. To him, the Southern problem is simply that of making efficient working men out of this material by giving them the requisite technical skills and the help of invested capital. The problem, however, is by no means as simple as this. From the obvious fact that these workmen have been trained for centuries as slaves, they exhibit therefore all the advantages and defects of such training. They are willing and good-natured, but not self-reliant, provident, or careful. If now the economic development of the South is to be pushed to the verge of exploitation, as seems probable, then we have a mass of working men thrown into relentless competition with the working men of the world, but handicapped by a training the very opposite of that the modern self-reliant democratic laborer. What the black laborer needs is careful personal guidance, group leadership of men with hearts in their bosoms, to train them to foresight, carefulness, and honesty. Nor does it require any fine-spun theories of racial difference to prove the necessity of such group training after the brains of the races have been knocked out by 250 years of assiduous education in submission, carelessness, and stealing. After emancipation it was the plain duty of someone to assume this group leadership and training of the Negro labor. I will not stop here to inquire whose duty it was, whether that of the white ex-master who had profited by unpaid toll, or the Northern philanthropist whose persistence brought on the crisis, or the national government whose edict freed the bondsman. I will not stop to ask whose duty it was, but I insist it was the duty of someone to see that these working men were not left alone and unguided, without capital, without land, without skill, without economic organization, without even the bald protection of law, order, and decency. Left in a great land, not to settle down to slow and careful internal development, but destined to be thrown almost immediately into relentless and sharp competition with the best of modern working men under an economic system where every participant is fighting for himself and too often utterly regardless of the rights or welfare of his neighbor. Where we must never forget that the economic system of the South today, which has succeeded the old regime, is not the same system as the old industrial north of England or of France, with their trade unions, their restrictive laws, their written and unwritten commercial customs, and their long experience. It is rather a copy of that England of the early 19th century, before the Factories Act. The England that wrung pity from thinkers and fired the wrath of Carlyle, the rod of empire that passed from the hands of Southern gentlemen in 1865, partly by force, partly by their own petulance, has never returned to them. Rather, it has passed to those men who have come to take charge of the industrial exploitation of the New South. The sons of poor whites, fired with a new thirst for wealth and power, thrifty and avaricious Yankees, and unscrupulous immigrants. Into the hands of these men, the Southern laborers, white and black, have fallen, and this is their sorrow. For the laborers as such, there is in these new captains of industry neither love nor hate, neither sympathy nor romance. It is a cold question of dollars and dividends. Under such a system, all labor is bound to suffer. Even the white laborers are not yet intelligent, thrifty, and well-trained enough to maintain themselves against the powerful inroads of organized capital. The results among them even are long hours of toil, low wages, child labor, and lack of protection against usury and cheating. But among the black laborers, all of this is aggravated. First, by race prejudice, which varies from a doubt and distrust among the best elements of white to a frenzied hatred among the worst. And secondly, it is aggravated, as I've said before, by the wretched economic heritage of the freedmen from slavery. With this training, it is difficult for the freedman to learn to grasp the opportunities already open to him, and the new opportunities are seldom given him, but go by favor to the whites. Left by the best elements of the South, with little protection or oversight, he has been made in law and custom the victim of the worst and most unscrupulous men in each community. The crop lien system, which is depopulating the fields of the South, is not the result of shiftlessness on the part of Negroes, but is also the result of cunningly devised laws as to mortgages, liens, and misdemeanors, which can be made by conscienceless men to entrap and snare the unwary until escape is impossible, further toil a farce and protest a crime. I have seen in the Black Belt of Georgia an ignorant, honest Negro buy and pay for a farm in installments 3 separate times, and then in the face of law and decency, the enterprising American who sold it to him pocketed the money and deed and left the black man landless, to labor on his own land at 30 cents a day. I've seen a black farmer fall into debt to a white shopkeeper, and that shopkeeper go to his farm and strip it of every single marketable article: mules, plows, stored crops, tools, furniture, bedding, clocks, looking glass, and all this without a sheriff or officer. In the face of the law for homestead exemptions, and without rendering to a single responsible person any account or reckoning. And such proceedings can happen and will happen in any community, where a class of ignorant toilers are placed by custom and race prejudice beyond the pale of sympathy and race brotherhood. So long as the best elements of a community do not feel in duty bound to protect and train and care for the weaker members of their group, they leave them to be preyed upon by these swindlers and rascals. This unfortunate economic situation does not mean the hindrance of all advance in the Black South, or the absence of a class of black landlords and mechanics who, in spite of disadvantages, are accumulating property and making good citizens. But it does mean that this class is not nearly so large as a fair economic system might easily make it, and those who survive in the competition are handicapped so as to accomplish much less than they deserve to, and that above all, the personnel of the successful class is left to chance and accident, and not to any intelligent culling or reasonable method of selection. As a remedy for this, there is but one possible procedure. We must accept some of the race prejudice in the South as a fact, deplorable in its intensity, unfortunate in its results, and dangerous for the future, but nevertheless a hard fact which only time can efface. We cannot hope then in this generation, or for several generations, that the masses of whites can be brought to assume that close, sympathetic, and self-sacrificing leadership of the blacks, which their present situation so eloquently demands. Such leadership, such social teaching and example must come from the blacks themselves. For some time, men doubted as to whether the Negro could develop such leadership, but today no one seriously disputes the capability of individual Negroes to assimilate the culture and common sense of modern civilization, and to pass it on to some extent at least to their fellows. If this is true, then there is the path out of the economic situation. And here is the imperative demand for trained Negro leaders of character and intelligence, men of skill, men of light and leading, college-bred men, black captains of industry, and missionaries of culture, men who thoroughly comprehend and know modern civilization and can take hold of Negro communities and raise and train them by force of precept and example, deep sympathy, and the inspiration of common blood and ideals. But if such men are to be effective, they must have some power. They must be backed by the best public opinion of these communities and able to wield for their objects and aims such weapons as the experience of the world has taught are indispensable to human progress. Of such weapons, the greatest perhaps in the modern world is the power of the ballot. And this brings me to a consideration of the third form of contact between whites and blacks in the South, political activity. In the attitude of the American mind towards Negro suffrage can be traced with unusual accuracy the prevalent concepts of government. In the 50s, we were near enough to the echoes of the French Revolution to believe pretty thoroughly in universal suffrage. We argued, as we thought, then rather logically, that no social class was so good, so true, and so disinterested as to be trusted wholly with the political destiny of its neighbors. That in every state, the best arbiters of their own welfare are the persons directly affected. Consequently, that it is only by arming every hand with a ballot, with the right to have a voice in the policy of the state, that the greatest good to the greatest number could be obtained. To be sure, there were objections to these arguments, but we thought we had answered them tersely and convincingly. If someone complained of the ignorance of voters, we answered, educate them. If another complained of their venality, we replied, disenfranchise them or put them in jail. And finally, to the men who feared demagogues and the natural perversity of some human beings, we insisted that time and bitter experience would teach the most hard-headed. It was at this time that the question of Negro suffrage in the South was raised. Here was a defenseless people suddenly made free. How were they to be protected from those who did not believe in their freedom and were determined to thaw it? Not by force, said the North. Not by government guardianship, said the South. Then by the ballot, the sole and legitimate defense of a free people, said the common sense of the nation. No one thought at the time that ex-slaves could use the ballot intelligently or very effectively, but they did think that the possession of so great power by a great class in the nation would compel their fellows to educate this class to its intelligent use. Meantime, new thoughts came to the nation. The inevitable period of moral regression and political trickery that ever follows the wake of war overtook us. So flagrant became the political scandals that reputable men began to leave politics alone, and politics consequently became disreputable. Men began to pride themselves on having nothing to do with their own government, and to agree tacitly with those who regarded public office as a private perquisite. In this state of mind, it became easy to wink at the suppression of the Negro vote in the South, and to advise self-respecting Negroes to leave politics entirely alone. The decent and reputable citizens of the North, who neglected their own civic duties, grew hilarious over the exaggerated importance with which the Negro regarded the franchise. Thus, it easily happens that more and more the better class of Negroes followed the advice from abroad and the pressures from home and took no further interest in politics, leaving to the careless and the venal of their race the exercise of their rights as voters. The black vote that still remained was not trained and educated, but further debauched by the open and unblushing bribery or force and fraud until the Negro voter was thoroughly inoculated with the idea that politics was a method of private gain by disreputable means. And finally, now today, when we are awakening to the fact that the perpetuity of Republican institutions on this continent depend on the purification of the ballot, the civic training of voters, the raising of voting to the plane of a solemn duty, which a patriotic citizen neglects to his peril and to the peril of his children's children. In this day, when we are striving for a renaissance of civic virtue, what are we going to say to the black voter of the South? Are we going to tell him still that politics is a disreputable and useless form of human activity? Are we going to induce the best classes of Negroes to take less and less interest in government and to give up their rights to take such an interest without a protest? I'm not saying a word against all legitimate efforts to purge the ballot of ignorance, pauperism, and crime, but few have pretended that the present movement for disenfranchising the South is for such a purpose. It has been plainly and frankly declared in nearly every case that the object of disenfranchisement laws is the elimination of the black man from politics. Now, is this a minor matter which has no influence on the main question of the industrial and intellectual development of the Negro? Can we establish a mass of black laborers and artisans and landholders in the South who by law and public opinion have absolutely no voice in shaping the laws under which they live and work? Can the modern organization of industry, assuming as it does free democratic government and the power and ability of the laboring class to compel respect for their welfare? Can this system be carried out in the South when half its laboring force is voiceless in the public councils and powerless in its own defense? Today, the black man of the South has almost nothing to say as to how much he shall be taxed, or how those taxes shall be expended, as to who shall execute the laws, and how they shall do it, as to who shall make the laws, and how shall they be made. It is pitiable that frantic efforts must be made at critical times to get lawmakers in some states even to listen to the respectful presentation of the black man's side of a current controversy. Daily, the Negro is coming more and more to look upon law and justice not as protecting safeguards, but as a source of humiliation and oppression. The laws are made by men who have little interest in them. They are executed by men who have absolutely no motive for treating the black people with courtesy or consideration. And finally, the accused lawbreaker is tried not by his peers, but too often by men who would rather punish 10 innocent Negroes than to let one guilty escape. I should be the last one to deny the patent weaknesses and shortcomings of the Negro people. I should be the last one to withhold sympathy from the white South in its efforts to solve its intricate social problems. I freely acknowledge that it is possible and sometimes best that a partially undeveloped people should be ruled by the best of their stronger and better neighbors for their own good. until such time as it can start and fight the world's battles alone. I've already pointed out how sorely in need of such economic and spiritual guidance the emancipated Negro was, and I'm quite willing to admit that if the representatives of the best white Southern public opinion were the ruling and guiding powers in the South today, the conditions indicate would be fairly well fulfilled. But the point I have insisted upon, and now emphasize again, is that the best opinion of the South today is not the ruling opinion. That to leave the Negro helpless and without a ballot today is to leave him not to the guidance of the best, but rather to the exploitation and debauchement of the worst. That this is no truer of the South than the North than of Europe, in any land, in any country under modern free competition, to lay any class of weak and despised people, be they white, black, or blue, at the political mercy of their stronger, richer, and more resourceful fellows is a temptation which human nature seldom has withstood and seldom will withstand. Moreover, the political status of the Negro in the South is closely connected with the question of Negro crime. There can be no doubt that crime among Negroes has sensibly increased in the last 30 years, and that there has appeared in the slums of great cities a distinct criminal class among the blacks. In explaining this unfortunate development, we must note two things. One, that the inevitable results of emancipation was to increase crime and criminals. And two, that the police system of the South was primarily designed to control slaves. As to the first point, we must not forget that under a strict slave system, there can scarcely be such a thing as crime. But when these variously constituted human particles are suddenly thrown broadcast on the sea of life, some swim, some sink, and some hang suspended to be forced up or down by the chance currents of a busy, hurrying world. So great an economic and social revolution as swept the South in '63 meant a weeding out among the Negroes of the incompetent and vicious, the beginning of a differentiation of social grades. Now a rising group of people are not lifted bodily from the ground like an inert solid mass, but rather stretch upward like a living plant, with its roots still clinging into the mold. The appearance, therefore, of the Negro criminal was a phenomenon to be awaited, and while it causes anxiety, it should not occasion surprise. Here again, the hope for the future depends particularly on careful and delicate dealings with these criminals. Their offenses at first were those of laziness, carelessness, and impulse, rather than a malignant or ungoverned viciousness. Such misdemeanors needed discriminating treatment, firm but reformatory, with no hint of injustice and full proof of guilt. For such dealing with criminals, white or black, the South has no machinery, no adequate jails or reformatories. Its police system was arranged to deal with blacks alone, and tacitly assumed that every white man was, ipso facto, a member of that police. Thus grew up a double system of justice, which erred on white side by undue leniency and the practical immunity of red-handed criminals, and erred on the black side by undue severity, injustice, and lack of discrimination. For as I've said, the police system of the South was originally designed to keep track of all Negroes, not simply of criminals. And when Negroes were freed and the whole South was convinced of the impossibility of free Negro labor, the first and almost universal device was to use the courts as a means of re-enslaving the blacks. It was not then a question of crime, but rather one of color that settled a man's conviction on almost any charge. Thus, Negroes came to look upon courts as instruments of injustice and oppression, and upon those convicted in them as martyrs and victims. When now the real Negro criminal appeared, and instead of petty stealing and vagrancy, we begin to have highway robbery, burglary, murder, and rape, there was a curious effect on both sides the color line. The Negroes refused to believe the evidence of white witnesses or the fairness of white juries, so that the greatest deterrent to crime, the public opinions of one's own social caste, was lost, and the criminal was looked upon as a crucified rather than hanged. On the other hand, the whites, used to being careless as to the guilt or innocence of accused Negroes, were swept in moments of passion beyond law, reason, and decency. Such a situation is bound to increase crime and has increased it. To natural viciousness and vagrancy are being daily added motives to revolt and revenge, which stir up all the latent savagery of both races and make peaceful attention to economic development often impossible. But the chief problem in any community cursed with crime is not the punishment of criminals, but the preventing of the young from being trained to crime. And here again, the peculiar situation of the South has prevented proper precautions. I've seen 12-year-old boys working in chains on public streets of Atlanta, directly in front of schools, in the company with old and hardened criminals. And this indiscriminate mingling of men and women and children makes the chain gang perfect schools for crime and debauchery. The struggle for reformatories, which has gone on in Virginia, Georgia, and other states, is the one encouraging sign of the awakening of some communities to the suicidal results of this policy. It is the public schools, however, which can be made outside the homes, the greatest means of training decent, self-respecting citizens. We have been so hotly engaged recently in discussing trade schools and the higher education that the pitiable plight of the public school system in the South has almost dropped from view. Of every $5 spent for public education in the state of Georgia, the white school gets $4 and the Negro $1. And even then, the white public school system, save in the cities, is bad and cries for reform. If this is true of the whites, what of the blacks? I'm becoming more and more convinced as I look upon the system of common school training in the South that the national government must soon step in and aid popular education in some way. Today it has been only by the most strenuous efforts on the part of the thinking men of the South that the Negro share of the school funds have not been cut down to a pittance in some half-dozen states. And that movement not only is not dead, but in many communities is gaining strength. What in the name of reason does this nation expect of a people, poorly trained and hard-pressed in severe economic conditions, without political rights, and with ludicrously inadequate common school facilities? What can it expect but crime and listlessness, offset here and there by the dogged struggles of the fortunate and more determined, who are themselves buoyed by the hope that in due time the country will come to its senses? I have thus far sought to make clear the physical, economic, and political relationships of the Negroes and whites in the South, as I have conceived them, including, for the reasons set forth, crime and education. But after all that has been said on these more tangible matters of human contact, there still remains a part essential to a proper description of the South, which is difficult to describe or fix in terms easily understood by strangers. It is, in fine, the atmosphere of the land, the thought and feeling, the 1,001 little actions which go to make up life. In any community or nation, it is these little things which are most elusive to the grasp and yet essential to any clear concept of the group life taken as a whole. What is thus true of all communities is particularly true of the South, where outside of written history and outside of printed law, there has been going on for a generation as deep a storm and stress of human souls, as intense a ferment of feeling, as intricate a writhing of spirit as ever a people experienced. Within and without the somber veil of color, vast social forces have been at work. Efforts for human betterment, movements towards disintegration and despair, tragedies and comedies in social and economic life, and a swaying and lifting and sinking of human hearts, which have made this land a land of mingling sorrow and joy, of change, excitement, and unrest. The center of this spiritual turmoil has ever been the millions of black freedmen and their sons, whose destiny is so faithfully bound up with that of the nation, and yet the casual observer visiting the South sees at first little of this. He notes the growing frequency of dark faces as he rides along, but otherwise the day zips lazily on, the sun shines, and this little world seems as happy and contented as other worlds he has visited. Indeed, on the question of questions, the Negro problem, he hears so little that there almost seems to be a conspiracy of silence. The morning paper seldom mentions it, and then usually in a far-fetched academic way, and indeed almost everyone seems to forget and ignore the darker side of the land, until the astonished visitor is inclined to ask if, after all, there is any problem here. But if he lingers long enough, there comes the awakening, perhaps in a sudden swirl of passion, which leaves him gasping at its bitter intensity, or more likely in a gradual, dawning sense of things he had not first noticed. Slowly but surely his eyes begin to catch the shadows of the color line. Here he meets the crowds of Negroes and whites. Then he is suddenly aware that he cannot discover a single black face. And again at the close of the day, wandering, he may find himself in some strange assembly where all faces are tinged brown or black, and where he has the vague, uncomfortable feeling of a stranger. He realizes at last that silently, resistlessly, the world about flows by him in two great streams. They ripple on in the same sunshine. They approach and mingle their waters in seeming carelessness. Then they divide and flow wide apart. It is done quietly, no mistakes are made, or if one occurs, the swift arm of the law and of public opinion swings down for a moment. As when the other day black man and a white woman were arrested for talking together on Whitehall Street in Atlanta. Now, if one notices carefully, one will see that between these two worlds, despite much physical contact and daily intermingling, there's almost no community of intellectual life or point of transference where the thoughts and feelings of one race can come into direct contact and sympathy with the thoughts and feelings of the other. Before and directly after the war, when all the best of the Negroes were domestic servants and the best of the white families, there were bonds of intimacy, affection, and sometime blood relationship between the races. They lived in the same home, shared in the family life, often attended the same church, and talked and conversed with each other. But the increasing civilization of the Negro since then has naturally meant the development of higher classes. There are an increasing number of ministers, teachers, physicians, merchants, mechanics, and independent farmers, who by nature and training are the aristocracy and leaders of the blacks. Between them, however, and the best elements of whites, there is little or no intellectual commerce. They go to separate churches, they live in separate sections, they are strictly separated in all public gatherings, they travel separately, and they are beginning to read different papers and books. To most libraries, lectures, concerts, and museums, Negroes are either not admitted at all or are on terms particularly galling to the pride of the very classes who might otherwise be attracted. The daily paper chronicles the doings of the black world from afar, with no great regard for accuracy, and so on. Throughout the categories of the means for intellectual communication, schools, conferences, efforts for social embetterment, and the like, it is usually true that the very representatives of the two races, who for mutual benefit and welfare of the land ought to be in complete understanding and sympathy, are so far strangers that one side thinks all whites are narrow and prejudiced, and the other thinks educated Negroes dangerous and insolent. Moreover, in a land where the tyranny of public opinion and intolerance of criticism is of obvious historical reasons so strong as in the South, such a situation is extremely difficult to correct. The white man, as well as the Negro, is bound and barred by the color line, and many a scheme of friendliness and philanthropy, of broad-minded sympathy and generous fellowship between the two, has dropped stillborn because some busybody was forced the color line to the front and brought the tremendous force of the unwritten law against the innovators. It is hardly necessary for me to add very much in regard to the social contacts between the races. Nothing has come to replace that finer sympathy and love between some master and house servants, which the radical and uncompromising drawing of the color line in recent years has caused almost completely to disappear. In a world where it meant so much to take a man by the hand and sit beside him, to look frankly into his eyes and feel his heart beating with red blood, in a world where a social cigar or a cup of tea together means more than legislative halls and magazine articles and speeches, one can imagine the consequences of almost utter absence of such social amenities between the strange races, whose separation extends even to parks and streetcars. Here there can be none of that social going down to the people, the opening of heart and hand of the best to the worst, and generous acknowledgement of a common humanity and a common destiny. On the other hand, in matters of simple almsgivings, where there can be no question of social contact, and in the succor of the aged and sick, the South, as if stirred by a feeling of its unfortunate limitations, is generous to a fault. The black beggar is never turned away without a good deal more than a crust, and a call for help for the unfortunate means quick response. I remember one cold winter in Atlanta when I refrained from contributing to a public relief fund, lest Negroes should be discriminated against. Were any black people receiving aid? Why, said he, they were all black. And yet this does not touch the kernel of the problem. Human advance is not a mere question of almsgiving, but rather of sympathy and cooperation among classes who would scorn charity. And here is a land where in the higher walks of life, in all of the higher strivings for the good and noble and true, the color line comes to separate natural friend and co-worker, while at the bottom of the social group, in the saloon, the gambling hell, and the brothel, that same line wavers and disappears. I've sought to paint a picture of real relations between the sons of masters and the man in the South. I have not glossed over matters for policy's sake, for I fear we have already gone too far in that sort of thing. On the other hand, I have sincerely sought to let no unfair exaggeration creep in. I do not doubt that in some Southern communities conditions are better than those I have indicated, while I am no less certain that in other communities they are far worse. Nor does the paradox and danger of this situation fail to interest and perplex the best conscience of the South. Deeply religious and intensely democratic as are the mass of whites, they feel acutely the false position in which the Negro problem places them. Such an essentially honest-hearted and generous people cannot cite the caste-leveling precepts of Christianity or believe in equality of opportunity for all men without coming to feel more and more with each generation that the present drawing of the color line is a flat contradiction to their beliefs and professions. But just as often as they come to this point, the present social condition of the Negro stands as a menace and portent before even the most open-minded. If there were nothing to charge against the Negro but his blackness or other physical peculiarities, they argue the problem could be comparatively simple. But what can we say of his ignorance, shiftlessness, poverty, and crime? Can a self-respecting group hold anything but the least possible fellowship with such persons and survive? And shall we let a mawkish sentiment sweep away the culture of our fathers or the hope of our children? The argument so put forth is of great strength, but it is not a whit stronger than the argument of thinking Negroes. Granted, they reply that the conditions of our masses is bad. There is certainly, on the one hand, accurate historical cause for this, and unmistakable evidence that no small number have, in spite of tremendous disadvantages, risen to the level of American civilization. And when by proscription and prejudice, these same Negroes are classed with and treated like the lowest of their people, simply because they are Negroes, such a policy not only discourages thrift and intelligence among black men, but puts a direct premium on the very thing you complain of, inefficiency and crime. Draw lines of crime, of incompetency, of vice as tightly and uncompromisingly as you will, for these things must be proscribed. But a color line not only does not accomplish this purpose, but thaws it. In the face of two such arguments, the future of the South depends on the ability of the representatives of those opposing views to see and appreciate and sympathize with each other's position. For the Negro to realize more deeply than he does at present the need of uplifting the masses of his people. For white people to realize more vividly than they have yet done the deadening and disastrous effect of color prejudice that classes Phyllis Wheatley and Sam Hose in that same despised class. It is not enough for Negroes to declare that color prejudice is the sole cause of their social condition, nor the white South to reply that their social condition is the main cause of prejudice. They both act as a reciprocal cause and effect, and a change in neither alone will bring the desired effect. Both must change, or neither can improve to any great extent. The Negro cannot stand the present reactionary tendencies and unreasonable drawing of the colored line indefinitely without discouragement and retrogression. And the condition of the Negro is ever the excuse for further discrimination. Only by a union of intelligence and sympathy across the color line in this critical period of the Republic shall justice and right triumph. That mind and soul accordingly well may make one music as before, but vaster,